for a health. Um, is I lost my train of thought. The message popped up, but anyways, um, it's a collaboration between the Traditional Native American Farmers Association and a Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. Uh, the Restoring Health for a Healthy Future. It came out of like, everybody's experienced the last few years, the COVID pandemic, and we were seeing different responses in a lot of our different communities, how they were having to deal with it. And it's one of the reoccurring, I guess, responses was um, to, I guess, address people's immune systems. And that was something that was doable, something that was needed and required. So we decided we'd come up with this series, not just addressing people's immune systems, but overall health of people, and how do we do that. Before I get too far into this, I just want to say a few words. Addressing everyone today, I can see people's faces, and I'm glad people are here in this virtual setting. And wherever you're at, we're grateful and we're thankful for the blessings we receive from the land, from the spirits around us, and that they also, wherever you're at, join us today and help us open our minds and our hearts, our ears to the words, and that we are able to benefit, and not only personally, but in our families and our communities, and that we will continue to move forward, and that through a guidance of not only the spirits, but through our ancestors. Real briefly, the Traditional Native American Farmers Association was formed back in 1992 from several days meetings with elders here in the Southwest US, New Mexico, and Arizona. They had brought up many concerns, and one of the concerns that they had voiced in this 2-day meeting was that they seen the decline of people's personal health due to, they were noticing that people's change in diet. And that was one of the things that our association has been trying to address since our founding in 1992. We've been able to find partnerships, collaborations over the years, and and find people that have, I guess, like minds and like ways of finding solutions within our communities. And so this is just one of the a series that we put together, and through collaborations and finding like-minded people. Through we try to make these events, I guess, similar to live events. If we're all sitting together in the same space, and what we're going to be doing is, or try to do anyways, is pull people's names at random and provide a small gift of traditional food. I can mail it from here, or if you're close by, I can deliver it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over, and we'll pull a name at random, and we'll announce that at the end of the series here. But I'll hand it back over to Nicole, and we can move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Clayton. I am just going to ask everyone as I figure this out to mute yourself so we don't have any background noise. I know there's a way that I can do it from here, but I haven't figured it out yet. If everyone could go ahead and mute themselves. And I just wanted to welcome Mariah Gladstone. I found Mariah when I was researching a while ago, and an Indigikitchen came up, and watching videos on there and watching YouTube talks that Mariah's given that span many, many years got me really interested. So when Clayton asked me about people to have on, Mariah's name popped up in my head because I was very interested in the way that she was using videos to present, especially during the pandemic when we all jumped on. That became really interesting for me. So without any further ado, I'll let Mariah introduce herself and let us know more about their work that they're doing. And we'll save questions for the end, but I'll go ahead and type them in, and I'll be keeping track of people's questions. And we will have that Q&A at the end of Mariah's presentation. If there are things that go along with the presentation, I might jump in and ask, but we'll try and save everything else for the end. Thanks.
Okay, nistina tanako omach kesta waka ki no pachtu tu sitikitsita pixachum nistu amskapi Piikuni ki kainai ki Tsalagi. Hello, everyone. My name is Walking Raven Woman. My government name is Mariah Gladstone. I am coming to you guys from the Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana, so just south of the Medicine Line, just to the east of the backbone of the world, the Continental Divide, the Rockies. And I am Blackfeet from Blackfeet Reservation, as well as Kainai, or blood from Blood Reserve in Canada. And my mom is Cherokee family in Oklahoma. So that tells you a little bit about who I am. And I'm very lucky to be the descendant of both a hunter-gatherer tradition and a rich farming and agricultural tradition. So I am lucky that I have both of those stories that are part of who I am. And I realize I have some slides on here that I put on here as a welcome to this webinar series, which a lot of you are already familiar with. So this is part of a 10-part virtual webinar series showcasing a lot of really cool other folks doing presentations as well. So I'm excited to be a part of this group and to share knowledge and the space with all of you today. So I get to talk about a whole bunch of fun things all about traditional Indigenous food revitalization and why that is so important. So I'm going to jump into my own presentation, but feel free as questions come up to put them in the chat. I can't guarantee that I'll answer them right away, but we'll find answers for the questions over the duration of this webinar. Also, I have to apologize because my brother has strep throat, which meant that he picked me up from the airport, and now I'm a little bit concerned. So I'm just going to sit here and sip on my moose broth because bone broth is where it's at, and that's how I'm going to fight the potential for throat demons. So as we talk about Indigenous food revitalization, it's super important to frame it within the appropriate historical context. The reason why we have to restore Indigenous foods is because there was so much very intentional work to destroy our food systems. And this started from the very, very early days of the United States government, and then later the Canadian government, or whatever the Crown and the Hudson's Bay Company was doing north of the Medicine Line before Canada became a nation. This was orders that were explicitly written from President George Washington, when the United States was only 2 years old, they wrote, "The immediate and total destruction and devastation of their settlements, the immediate objects of the total destruction and devastation of their settlements. It'll be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent them from planting more." So the orders were very clear, not just to target Haudenosaunee peoples in the march against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but to target food systems, to target the fields, to prevent them from planting more, their storehouses of food, seed banks, gardens, everything, to cripple people's ability to feed themselves. And this motivation and strategy continued to take place in a number of different ways across the continent. So as colonists pushed to the west, they continued to target indigenous food systems. Now, part of this was simply because it was easier to target food systems than to target people themselves. Native folks have long histories of warrior traditions, and it was often much easier to simply attack food systems than to target the people themselves. So this is a quote from the 1850 Commissioner of Indian Affairs report, which writes, "It is cheaper in the end to feed the whole flock for a year than to fight them for a week." Essentially, this is very clear direction that the strategy to approach indigenous people's control and to, of course, render the plains empty was to target food systems. On the Great Plains, this often meant targeting bison populations or buffalo, but this took place in a number of different ways. Obviously, forced relocations of people from the Southeast into the Great Lakes really meant that seeds that had been cultivated for those specific areas, the traditional homelands of the indigenous people that bred those seeds, would not grow as well in the new places that they were being forcibly moved to. So seeds in the Great Lakes didn't always grow well in Oklahoma. Similarly, seeds that grew in the Southeast, Georgia, North Carolina area, didn't always grow well in Oklahoma either. And so people had to navigate challenges within the food systems, not just from the decimation of bison populations, but also a number of other factors as well. I am sure that you guys have seen this picture a number of different times. This is a pile of bison skulls. I think this is probably one of the more dramatic images that demonstrates just how many bison were slaughtered. Of course, conservative estimates put bison populations at around, I want to say, 30 million bison on the plains prior to colonial contact. And by the time where I live, Montana became a state in 1889, we were looking at less than 1,000 bison in existence. And so we also know that from a genetics perspective, that created a very tight bottleneck within bison genetics, which meant that all bison are descended from those about 1,000 individuals, which means that they lost a lot of natural resistance to different diseases and infections and things like that. It also meant that for the prairies, which ecologically rely on bison for aeration, for biodiversity, for germination of certain plant species, those prairies really suffered with the loss of the bison as well. And of course, the goal to control indigenous people was realized in that without bison, without these buffalo on the landscapes, people were forced to depend on government rations, exactly as that 1850 Commissioner of Indian Affairs report outlined. This is a quote from a railroad conductor. He said, "It's a mercy they can't eat bones. We were never able to control the savages until their food supply was cut off." And I'm not sure if you guys know why they collected all these bison skulls in the first place. it's interesting because we know that in many cases, this meat was never taken. The buffalo were often stripped of their hides, and then the hides were taken off to be tanned and used to make machine belts. This was, of course, the start of the Industrial Revolution, which meant that bison hides were some of the most durable machine belts at the time. Unfortunately, this also meant that almost all of that meat was just left to rot on the prairies, go completely to waste, except for some of the scavengers that would pick off the bones. And then those bones were just left on the prairies and bleached out by the sun. Later, Native people were paid a couple pennies to go and pick up as many bones as they can and transport them back to trading areas so that they could be ground down into basically bone meal and shipped away to be used in a couple of different utilizations. That includes bone china. It includes as a filler in gunpowder, and it includes fertilizer. We know that bone meal makes a fertilizer for landscapes. I also see this and this image as a direct connection to the amount of soil fertility that had already been lost over about 20 years at this point of the tilling that was happening on the prairies. So in places where the soil was suddenly being tilled up and these old growth prairies were being farmed, there was a huge loss of soil fertility, nutrients, and the bison bones were being used to supplement that, to be able to restore some of those nutrient losses. I think this also speaks a great deal to the decimation of soil health and nutrient loss that comes with monoculture agriculture and these big large-scale tilling practices that indigenous agriculture did not have as central to the way that it was traditionally done. We know that indigenous people were sustainably practicing agriculture by recognizing sustainable polyculture planting, including things like the Three Sisters, by recognizing crop rotation, by only engaging in small tilling practices, so only surface level movement of soil, not breaking up those deep connections, mycorrhizal communities, all of that stuff. So I think that this picture, though it's of bison, also speaks to the real big shift that happened as folks moved from sustainable indigenous agriculture to the type of colonial agriculture that was brought. So this is also interesting because I think that this speaks to a lot of the shift that was being forced on Native people, even within the realm of agriculture. As I mentioned, Natives have been successful farmers for a long time. But the ways in which farming were done were typically as community agriculture. They were done as villages. Villages farm village land to feed the community. But the Dawes Act of 1887, which is essentially like the Homestead Act of reservations, was about dividing up those lands and trying to civilize Native people in different ways. For this, it was interesting because colonial morality dictated that the most righteous way of being a farmer was, of course, in a family farm on a rectangular plot of land, and not to go necessarily where the food grew best. You know, if you are someone that forages, you know that your wild onions and your prairie turnips and your choke cherries or your huckleberries and your camas or whatever it may be doesn't grow in a contiguous 160-acre plot. Things grow where they're meant to grow best. And if you go and recognize those ecological landscapes and can go and harvest from those areas, you have a chance at nourishing those places without trying to make everything fit into one quite literal box. So even communities that had practiced community agriculture were forced into this system of family farming. We also know that, of course, after lands were divided up and deeds were given to head of household, then there was suddenly leftover land, quote unquote, which was then given away to settlers. So that's how we end up with these fractionated reservations where there is private land that's held by non-native people. There's land held privately by native people, and then there's still land held in trust by the tribe, or by the federal government for the tribe. So that's how we get these crazy checkerboard landscapes on our reservations with all sorts of weird jurisdictional issues and all of that. I live in an area where there are quite a few non-native landowners. And so I also live in a tourist area. So in the summer, we get tourists coming through and I do different presentations. And of course, inevitably, there will be tourists that are asking, are we on the reservation right now? Yes, yes, we are. And of course, then they say, but when we were driving past houses, we saw white people. Why are there white people? And I'm like, quote, totally want to have a Mean Girls moment, of course, where I'm just like, you can't just ask people why they're white. But of course, we know that that is because of the Dawes Act and this fractionalization of land and this forced template of what was considered good agriculture, which was, of course, family farms, monoculture agriculture. And then, of course, from that point, we get different things that have been pushed on farmers to, plant with these mass-produced seeds rather than our traditional varieties, and pesticides and synthetic fertilizers and all of those things as well. So all part of the ways in which Native people were forced to adapt to different scenarios. So the result was realized in that rations, of course, became the ways in which Native people started to depend on for their food. Of course, when people were no longer allowed to go to the places where their foraged foods grow best, they were moved away from the lands where their traditional seeds grew best. Dams were built that stopped seasonal floods that were responsible for irrigation and replenishment of soil fertility. Dams were built that cut fish out of the diets of upstream tribes. And of course, the massive decimation of buffalo populations. So all of this culminated in Native people really starting to depend on rations as their main source of food. And we know that from this time, we get things being developed like fry bread and other types of starvation survival food that comes from rations. Of course, after rations, we get the commodity food program, still known as FDIPR, the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, COMODS, and we get things that are designed to be shelf stable, cheaply produced, and transported over long distances. So this is also really important to recognize just this massive and rapid dietary shift with Native people that occurred. And all of this, as I mentioned, was very intentional. The goal was to force Native people to depend on government food programs so that we could not push back against colonial expansion. You can't bite the hand that is quite literally feeding you, right? And so with this in mind, Native people have been forced to adapt to different ways. And now, in the 21st century, we really have this huge wave of folks looking at how to restore indigenous food systems, to build food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is it's defined in different ways. You can say it is a community's ability to feed themselves. but I think it goes a lot deeper. I love the definition of food sovereignty defined by La Via Campesina and the peasants movement, which is really a 4-pillared approach to indigenous food systems, or to food sovereignty. So the first is food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy, affordable, culturally appropriate food harvested through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. So we, of course, want food that is healthy, right? It needs to nourish people on a very basic level. Needs to provide the important macronutrients, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, all of those things for our bodies to get us through our days, including all of our physical activity and brain power and everything that we need. We need healthy food. Affordable. If the poorest people in our communities cannot afford food, we don't have affordable food systems. So that's really important to recognize when we're looking at how to build food sovereignty too. We don't want to have communities that depend on food banks. We don't want to have communities where food banks are necessary. We want food that is affordable for everybody. Culturally appropriate. So that means different things in different places because food is defined in different cultural ways depending on where you're at. For people in the United States, we could probably create entire school lunch menus based entirely on healthy, affordable food that was all insect protein based. And we could make meals out of that. But that in the United States is not necessarily considered culturally appropriate. They're not things that we see as food. And that's all that really means, is that those things need to make sense. When people were given rations that kept them alive, but were made of wheat flour and food that, beef, things that people were not familiar with, didn't like the taste of, and had to figure out how to work with, those were not culturally appropriate foods, even if they were providing enough calories to keep people alive. And then finally, harvested through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. We want to make sure that however we're getting our food is not depleting our ability to feed ourselves going forward. We're not destroying our soil fertility. We're not poisoning our waters. We're not over harvesting our fish. None of those things. We want to make sure that those sustainable methods are encoded in the ways that we do things. And finally, I like to go a step further and say that it is also important for food sovereignty to have the right to govern those food systems. So for Indigenous nations that have the right to write our own food and agricultural policies, to have our own laws and our own court systems and our own enforcement, it's important to be able to write food and agriculture codes, recognizing food safety, looking at meat processing inspection, looking at how we define organic, what kind of fertilizer rates are allowed within our communities, et cetera, et cetera. So the right to govern those food systems is also really, really important. So this is a really great graphic that I love, and I've borrowed from the NATIVES organization, which is the North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems nonprofit. It's ran by the Sioux Chef organization, which is, of course, Sean Sherman's brainchild, and of course, partner to the Owamni restaurant, which won Best New Restaurant in the United States with the recent James Beard Award. So really, really exciting stuff. I like this because it breaks down food systems into more than just the foods themselves. We, of course, as Native people recognize, food systems are, here's what we can eat. So look at the plants that we eat, whether they're farmed or foraged, all of that, that's great. Animals, whether that's fish or deer or moose or insects or birds, whatever that may be, those things also fall into that category. And then of course, fungi as well. But there's also so much more to indigenous food systems. You know, of course, when you are learning about plant identification for wild foraging, you not just learn about that plant's edible, right? So I can think of a half dozen plants. You know, I have fireweed that's starting to grow out in my yard right now. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, that plant's edible. But that doesn't answer the question of how do you eat it? What parts do you eat? When do you harvest it? How do you cook it? How do you preserve it? And, you know, how do I make a meal that makes sense that my kids are going to eat too, with this fireweed? Right now, fireweed shoots, by the way, can be cut and cooked just like asparagus. So you could saute them with some garlic butter. You could throw them on the grill, do lots of things like that. Fireweed flowers later in the summer when they bloom are entirely edible. So you can toss them on a salad. You can mix them for pretty pink color in a number of different dishes. You could use them as decorative flower toppings on your plated meals. You could make fireweed honey. You can also make something called Ivan chai, which is actually taking the fireweed leaves, rolling them so that it's breaking that cell wall and kind of making the leaves wet. And then you put them in a jar or somewhere where they're not going to dry out super fast, and you let them ferment for a couple days. You don't want them to get moldy, but you want them to ferment. And then you take them and you dry them out completely, and you have a fermented fireweed leaf tea. This has been called a number of different things, but if you look it up, it's called Ivan chai or Ivan tea, because it was also really common of a food in Siberia, and folks within present day Russia would make this as well. So super delicious tea that you can make, but also there's so much knowledge that goes along besides just fireweed is edible, right? And so many foods are like that. We know from, of course, the folks at NAFSA that work with the seed keepers. They're recognized that there's so much that goes into seed saving and seed breeding and all of that knowledge of traditional farmed foods. And then of course there's traditional planting methods. So looking at Three Sisters methods of cultivation, you know, corn, beans, and squash, and the ways in which those are done, or the species or subspecies, the different varieties of those plants that are planted, depending on where you're at. You know, people in the Northeast grew the Three Sisters, but also people in the Southwest grew the Three Sisters. And those are very, very different climates with very different growing seasons, different soil conditions, different water. And so the varieties of corn, beans, and squash that were grown in those different locations have to make sense in place. It is very much, as we define indigenous, it is rooted in place. And so that is rooted in place as well. So besides just plants and animals and all of the knowledge along with those things, I enjoy this because it looks at the elements of the food, or the elements of the landscape, as part of the resources for food systems. So I live in Montana, and we have relatively dry air here, which means that our air, our lack of humidity actually becomes a resource for food preservation. We can air dry things relatively quickly. You know, when it comes time and I have a ton of zucchini coming out of my garden, I can spiral cut those so they look like little slinkies, and I can hang them up in my living room. And the air is plenty dry enough that those little zucchini slinkies will dry out into little crispy zucchinis, and I can keep them like that, or I can grind them into zucchini flour. I can do a number of different things. I can do the same thing with dry meat if I want to. It's just because the air is dry enough that it makes it possible. If I was still in grad school in upstate New York, there is very different climactic conditions. It's humid. It's super humid, especially in the summertime. And you can't just dry out food in the air. It requires different techniques. So for example, you can use smoke drying, or you can use sun drying. You can use wind drying, just different preservation methods, salt drying, different things that are going to pull the moisture out of the food in ways that you may not get just from having really dry air. So that is a challenge that goes along with different places, but also resources, you know, depending on the geology of certain landscapes, there may be, for example, flint, which is useful for knife making, perhaps obsidian, different things that can be knapped and used for knives. You may have rocks that are really good for rapid heat changes that aren't going to explode when you put them in cold water right out of a fire, which is how water was traditionally boiled before people had metal pans. Look at snow and ice usage, so that freeze thaw temperatures that happen at night. When you look at the freezing temperatures at night, the thawing temperatures during the day, you can actually look at that as a resource that has been used as a resource for, well, first, let's say for turning maple sap into maple syrup by letting it freeze at night, pulling that water off the top and letting that amount of sugar become more concentrated until you're left with more of a syrup, right? So that freeze thaw is a resource for food systems and cooking. Similarly, in the Andes, the Incan Empire, as well as other communities that lived there, would preserve potatoes using that freeze thaw technique. Harvest the potatoes in the fall and smash them. Just smash to the potatoes. So the water will start coming out of these mashed potatoes, essentially. At night, the temperatures would drop below freezing. You'd get frozen ice on the top of the potatoes. You come out in the morning, you pull that ice off, and you smash them more. And you keep doing that day after day, and you end up essentially with freeze-dried potatoes, which are super lightweight, easy to pack, easy to throw in some water and rehydrate, and they will last for a long time. And you can still buy papa seca from Peruvian grocery stores or on Amazon or all manner of different things, because it's based on that indigenous wisdom, and that's still practiced, though in different ways. But it's essentially just freeze-dried potatoes. It's actually really interesting to look back at old records of the conquistadors like Pizarro in the area, who was like, these potatoes are stupid. They don't last for a long time, because they were used to their grains that they could just pack in the bottom of their boats, and they would go, you know, as long as they didn't get wet, being stored in their barrels or whatever, they could have those flours and those grains kept for a long period of time. They couldn't do that with potatoes, because you can only keep potatoes for so long before they start sprouting eyes or God forbid, going rotten, and then you have rotten potatoes that smell gross. But they were thinking of all of this without the indigenous wisdom that goes with it. So I think that there are a lot of stories about indigenous food systems that only make sense when they have the context of the indigenous knowledge that goes with them. You can't pick and choose, you know, you can't pick all these indigenous foods, but ignore the wisdom of how to eat them. People ask me to tell more mushroom stories, so this is something that came to mind. There's not a ton of edible mushrooms in my immediate area. We have morels, and we have these beautiful puffballs. And it's interesting, if you look at Blackfeet Lodge designs, you may occasionally see painted lodges that have these white circles. These are our puffball mushrooms, actually. And they come from a story of a woman, an earth woman that married a sky person. And she was brought up to Skyland, and she became pregnant with his child, but eventually wanted to come back down to earth. And so she brought her child with her, But she was given instructions from the sky people: do not let your child touch the ground for 7 days. And at the end of 7 days, then your child will just be like any other earth baby and can touch the ground. Well, this woman had gone outside the lodge very briefly on the 6th day. She had her mom watching the baby, but her mom wasn't watching the baby as closely as she should have been, because the baby rolled over off of the buffalo robe and touched the ground. And so when the woman came back inside the lodge, she realized that this baby had transformed into a puffball. And that's how we have puffball mushrooms, because it is a reminder to watch your children. But it is also a story of a gift from the sky world, and a reminder of the presence of this mushroom in even our lodge designs. I mentioned the three sisters really briefly. I mentioned the harms of monoculture agriculture. And for folks in this group, you're probably very familiar with the three sisters. Corn, beans, and squash, of course, refer to this method of planting generally in mounds, but they can be planted in rows as well. Corn obviously grows tall and straight, like this other image of monoculture corn. It grows up. It is planted generally before beans, so that when beans come up, they have an already sprouting trellis to start climbing their way up to the top of. They grow up, and as they use corn as a trellis, they also, as a legume, have root nodules, which contain nitrogen fixing bacteria and help pull nitrogen out of the air and re-enrich it into the soil. So that is super helpful for just replenishing those nutrients, especially since corn and squash are heavy feeders. That is just particularly useful, especially as we talk about all of these synthetic fertilizers that are dumped on our fields now, ammonium nitrate and things of that sort, which attempt to help restore nitrogen, but also end up as a lot of runoff going into our waterways. Lastly, we have squash, which spreads out on the ground. If you've been in a pumpkin patch, if you've grown zucchini, if you have any type of squash anywhere, you know that squash spreads out like crazy, and is low to the ground. It provides a lot of shade, which helps prevent evaporation from the soil, helps prevent water loss from the soil, and it also provides that shade, which doesn't allow weeds, competitor weeds, to get into the soil, and they don't get enough sunlight to really provide a heavy competition with the other plants. And of course, together, corn, beans, and squash form a complete protein. There's some amazing research by Jane Mount Pleasant from Cornell University, which showcases the yields, the crop yields of corn, beans, and squash when planted together. She did traditional Haudenosaunee planting methods, but I imagine the results would be similar depending on the different environments. And then she planted those plants as monocultures. She planted hectares of corn by itself, beans by itself, and squash by itself, and then did an analysis of caloric and protein yield. And what she found was you get more calories and more protein per hectare when you plant with traditional Haudenosaunee Three Sisters planting methods. This is interesting because her research also relied on consuming a lot of those squash seeds. So some of them were, of course, saved, but a lot were used as food as well. So, of course, we know that squash seeds are really high in nutrients, including a lot of protein and good fats, and they can be used for a number of different things. I use pumpkin seeds to grind up, make into flour, and then bake brownies with. So you can use pumpkin seeds for a number of different things, but her research kind of relied on consuming the seeds as well, which was a cool thing that she learned. more food stories. This is something that's especially relevant to folks living in areas with this beautiful flower. This is camas. Camas is actually a root vegetable, but it's really high in inulin. Inulin is the compound that's in sunchokes. Sunchokes are cousin to sunflowers. They have gotten a weird name, Jerusalem artichokes, because Spanish speakers that saw sunchokes translated, well, they named them girasol, and then some English speakers heard the Spanish speakers calling them girasol, and which is faces the sun, and then decided to translate that to Jerusalem. It's an indigenous food. It's really high in inulin, and now it has the nickname fartichokes because if you don't cook sunchokes long enough, they give you horrible indigestion. Same thing with camas, only 10 times worse. So traditionally, camas was cooked as a pit roast. It was done in these great big camas bakes, and these camas bakes would basically, you dig a hole, you build a fire, let it burn down to coals, and then from there, you are able to put a whole bunch of leaves on top of the coals or some type of barrier. I think these people are using like a canvas cloth or something. You cover it up with the dirt and then the barrier, and then you put your camas bulbs themselves in this pit. You cover it up with another barrier, more dirt, and then you build another fire and you keep moving these hot coals on top of your pit so that you pit roast those. And it's like slow cooking caramelization over 36 hours. And it turns all that inulin into delicious kind of caramelized carbohydrates. So you get sugars and really digestible carbs that you can consume. This is a traditional method of doing this, but you can also do this now in your own kitchen in a slow cooker, like a crock pot, by putting a colander in there with a little bit of water, and you let them steam cook for about 48 hours. And you can have super delicious vegetables. You can eat those right away after they're done pit roasting. You can dry them out, you can freeze them, you can pan fry them, you can mash them, you can do a number of things. And they kind of end up tasting like a sweet potato / chestnut at the same time. But it's all dependent on indigenous knowledge. If you don't know how to cook camas, you don't have a lot of use in harvesting camas. And also it's important to know how to identify camas. It's this beautiful blue flower, but if you're harvesting it at a time when you can't see the flowers, it has a lookalike cousin that has a white flower. Again, if the flowers aren't on the plants, you better know how to recognize them because it's called death camas and it will kill you. Super toxic. So things to know, plant identifications, how to cook things, time of the year you harvest them. I'll mention that time of the year for camas. If you aren't great at identifying them, harvest them when they have a flower on them. If you can recognize the flowers after they die off, then wait until after those flowers are going to seed, because then the flowers are going to seed. There's going to be more camas coming up in the future. And also the nutrients have gone back into the bulb that you're going to be consuming rather than all that energy being exerted making flowers. So this is the work that I get to do. I get to have a ton of fun making cooking videos for my show, which is Indigikitchen. I have kind of an online library of indigenous food recipes, both really traditional foods as well as modern foods, things that we make in the modern kitchen. So this is my super janky camera setup that I started with. You can see the tripod wouldn't support the weight of the camera. So I jerry-rigged the thing with a headband and a screw. And then I started editing videos using Windows Movie Maker, which is the most janky of all video software. I have since then upgraded, watched a lot of YouTube videos on how to use Adobe Premiere and do things like that. And then I get to make cooking videos that make this knowledge really accessible to people. You remember at the beginning, I said this was really intentional work to disconnect people from our traditional food systems. It has to be really intentional so that we can Google our traditional recipes, so that we can have this information at our fingertips in ways that make sense today. People want to connect more with Indigenous knowledge, and this is just part of making that information accessible to people, to disseminating that knowledge. This is a workshop I did up in Vermont right before the pandemic started. And this was an all-day workshop on nishtamalizing corn, which is, again, more Indigenous foods knowledge. In order to make corn digestible, you have to treat it with a highly alkaline solution. So typically this was done by making a slurry of wood ashes and water. Now it's done using culinary lime, though you can still use wood ashes and water. And that makes basically a lye bath, a highly alkaline solution that chemically removes the hull of the corn. That also softens the corn. It adds calcium. It turns the bound niacin into free niacin, and you get a much more digestible version of corn that your body can actually utilize all those nutrients from. And when you grind it up, it's masa. So you can make tortillas and arepas and cornbreads and all these delicious foods that's made with the masa. If you ground up dried corn without nishtamalizing it, you'd get cornmeal. Cornmeal, by the way, is super hard to just grind up dried corn. If you don't nishtamalize it, it's hard. It doesn't work very well. And then if you add water to it, you just have wet cornmeal. It doesn't stick together. It's just wet. And you can't get the niacin in it. There's no calcium from the wood ashes. And so, of course, when corn was brought back to Europe with Columbus, they had their big grinding mills that they'd been using for grinding other grain. So they put corn in that. They started growing a ton of corn. They started eating a ton of corn, but they were eating it as polenta and cornbread, basically the cornmeal versions of corn, the unnishtamalized versions. And so people started getting diseases, namely pellagra, which is a niacin deficiency, because their diets had shifted from accessible forms of niacin, like from wheat, to inaccessible forms of niacin, like unnishtamalized corn. Nishtamalized, by the way, is spelled Nixtamalization. That X sound makes a sh because it comes from the Aztec language. And tamal, you guys will of course recognize. So these peasants were suddenly consuming a ton of corn, not getting the niacin, getting niacin deficiency called pellagra. One of the symptoms of niacin deficiencies is severe photosensitivity to UV rays, where your skin essentially looks like it's just starting to burn when it gets into the sunlight. And so, of course, from this time that we also had huge vampire scares because people were being exposed to the sunlight and their skin looked like it was burning. And of course, Eastern Europe at the time just, didn't understand nishtamalization, didn't want to be told what to do, and instead thought vampires were a much more reasonable explanation for why people's skin was burning, rather than they weren't using the indigenous knowledge. So there's a fun corny story. But this is the fun
Mariah,
stuff.
I just want to do a time check-in with you and let you know it is 2:07 and we're ending at 2:30. But if we have a little time for questions along the way, so I'll let you.
Yeah, for sure. I was just gonna flash some pretty food porn pictures up, and then I have my last slide and I can go through and answer all the questions that people have. So this is just a whole bunch of recipes that are available on my website as a resource to folks. I have everything from blue corn crusted lake trout with lamb's quarter pesto, choke cherry braised rabbit on cornbread with some candied pecans. I have peanut butter and pumpkin seed cookies, sunflower seed butter caramel popcorn, because those are the OG delicious indigenous snacks, right? And then this is my information as well for folks that are interested in checking out some of those recipes or following along on social media, or may have questions later. But let's hop in and see what questions people have been asking.
One question that I got was when you were talking about the three sisters, someone wanted to know the name of the person that did the study.
Her name is Jane, Jane, Mount Pleasant, and she's at Cornell University. I will drop that in here. Jane Mount Pleasant, Cornell.
Okay, and if you want to come off mute and ask a question, you're welcome to do that. I wanted to apologize. The chat, somehow I was not able to change it so everyone could see each other.
I
in the
realize
chat.
that a lot of the messages are just direct to me. So
yes. So yeah, so I'm not sure how to turn it on so everyone could see those messages, but that was one. So if people want to come on, and they can unmute to ask these questions, and we'll give people a second for that.
Interesting. Okay. Clayton mentioned that phosphorus and calcium come from bone meal. Yes, Central America also has the three sisters. They have a milpa system. So in Central America, occasionally there was a fourth sister, which was peanuts, that were grown alongside the others. Peanuts are also a legume. So they grow similarly to beans and also have nitrogen fixing properties as well. So, but there were other super important crops in Central America. In addition to the three sisters, actually, chia and amaranth were also really important in Central America. So some cool grain knowledge.
Hi, it's Elizabeth Kincaid here. I'm driving, so I'm trying to be responsible. Quickly, to the best of my knowledge, Native Americans and Sephardic Jews, that's Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition, are the only two people groups that I have found where their foodways were attacked or used against them. Do you have any other civilizations or cultures that might have experienced the same thing? Thank you.
Yes. Give me a second, because I gotta think of there's a fair number of modern examples too, where that scorched earth method, that terminology that was created in the early days of the US government, that scorched earth method was used even in conflicts like across Africa. Who's our favorite? Hold on, that was being sarcastic, so that wasn't a good answer. Let me look that up right now. If someone else has a question, I can probably answer another question while I'm looking at that.
While they're coming up with a question, I want to make a comment too.
Yeah, for sure.
Talk about the question was about attacking cultural foodways. Just recently, and I don't know exactly where, but I believe it was in the Middle East that they were trying to pass laws that made it illegal to save your traditional seeds. So that's very recent.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've done work with the United Nations or their affiliated groups. So I was just at the World Food Forum in Rome at the FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization. And there's a whole coalition of indigenous food knowledge keepers, chefs, farmers, indigenous youth working on food revitalization from all over the world. So, you can look at, so for example, the Sami in what's now the northern part of Norway and Sweden, the Sami are traditional reindeer herders, and the Sami have gone through various periods where their food systems have been attacked. Also, Sami children were forced into boarding schools and forced to speak Norwegian. It's very similar to native children because they were living nomadically and living with the reindeer herds. So that's something that's happened. They weren't allowed to consume their traditional reindeer meat because it wasn't being processed in inspected facilities. And so that, I mean, Sami reindeer herding culture is still being attacked today. And that's something, you know, they have their Sami National Congress that they have to fight all these fights out with the Norwegian government. So that's something that's still happening. If you look at South African food culture, you know, there's I'm friends with a South African indigenous chef down there, and she talks a lot about how they were forced to grow corn. And so her grandma grew a traditional, it's like a ground nut. It's a legume, it's good for the soil, high in protein, but they were forbidden from growing things like their traditional foods. And instead, their farmers in South Africa were forced to plant giant fields of corn. And of course, it's that, you know, mass produced, genetically modified corn. But that they were forced to do that. So for us, you know, we look at corn as like a sacred and traditional food, but also in other indigenous places around the world, people have been forced to plant corn instead of their traditional foods. So that's interesting in and of itself. And at various places, you know, people have forbidden land management practices that are really essential to biodiversity, including traditional burns. So if you look at indigenous people around Thailand, traditional burning methods of their rainforests were actually part of the ways in which they restored biodiversity, and they did some farming, and then they would let it return to rainforest, and then they would burn out somewhere else, and they would use that as their farmlands. And so there is a restoration of that traditional knowledge now, and you should definitely check out the FAO Indigenous Peoples section, because that is specifically Food and Agriculture Organization, and we have a coalition of Indigenous members with the FAO that are fighting for some of that intentional work to take place to restore Indigenous land practices, especially as we look at the biodiversity of the lands held by Indigenous people around the world. It's empirically demonstrated that Native peoples are maintaining the biodiversity for the entire globe right now. So I don't know if that answers the question, but those are a couple of different examples. But yeah, food has been used as a weapon in a lot of different food systems, or in a lot of different cultural areas, time periods, everything.
More
Thank you.
questions?
Yeah, thank you from Saskatchewan. Okay. Okay, perfect, beautiful. Yep, South Africa, yep. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the whole Green Revolution, quote unquote, which really pushed a lot of like high yielding seeds that were specifically designed to work with certain pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. That was a whole, 1970s, 1960s push against people's food systems that was really designed to produce more food, but people's food systems had been attacked, and that's what left people so desperate to try these Green Revolution techniques. So
I had a question, Mariah. I was watching one of your videos about food as a tool for healing, and I wanted to hear about your journey with that as well, your personal journey, how you moved into that work and how you've seen community healing and personal healing, familial healing, with that food work.
Yeah. So I got started in this work. I was lucky to be a kid that grew up in a family of hunters. So we'd always have wild game meat, and my dad and my grandpa fenced off a part of our yard from the dogs and built a garden. So I was lucky that I was familiar with where food came from. But I didn't get started doing food sovereignty work until I had graduated college, and people kept talking about the health epidemics that were plaguing Indian country. Massive rates of diabetes and malnutrition and obesity and heart disease and all these things that are affected by our diets. And so I said, there's all this conversation about, needing to go back to traditional foods and eat more traditional foods and do all of that. But we also know that we can't just put butternut squash in front of people and people know what to do with it, right? We can't just say like, here's a deer and people know how to field dress it and turn it into food that their family is going to eat, right? And so there's more knowledge that has to be restored. So I'm like, I'm just going to start a cooking show and I'm going to call it Indigikitchen. And I was at a food sovereignty conference. It was Seeds of Native Health in Minneapolis. And I was there. I was taking vacation days from my job at the railroad, running a steel gang, which was quite literally my job title. I was a steel gang roadmaster. And I bailed on that to go on to a food sovereignty conference. And someone was there and they said, sure you are, Mariah. Like, you're not going to start a cooking show. So then I had to, but of course, my undergraduate degree is in environmental engineering. I don't have a background in culinary arts. I grew up cooking. I grew up creating recipes, but I'm not a formally trained chef. And I don't have a background in videography, but I know how to use YouTube to look up how to do things. And so I started doing what I could. I got in touch with my friends and I contacted them and got them to send me recipes, and I worked on building this. And even though I started it to help restore this, the health of our physical bodies, I realized that traditional foods is way, way, way more than the health of our physical bodies. It is our connection to landscape. It is recognizing that incredible depth of wisdom of our ancestors and the generations of time-tested indigenous science, whether it be, with traditional medicines, whether it be through agricultural cultivation, whether it's looking at predictors of weather, whether it's polyculture and looking at soil replenishment and all of those things. There's so much more to it. And then it's, of course, connection with our own well-being. It's knowing where our food comes from, and it's recognizing these gifts that the land has been giving us, and knowing how to see those gifts and see them as gifts, because I think that encourages us to give gifts back. When we know where our food comes from, we have a deeper responsibility to take care of those places, to take care of that water, to take care of that soil, to take care of the other animals that also rely on it. If you have your favorite berry picking spot, and every time you're out there picking berries, you see birds and maybe you run into a bear, you see all these other animals, you see these other plants that rely on the shade of the berries, whatever it may be. When a development threatens the cleanliness of the water that those berries need, you see it not only as my berries are threatened, but you see it as those birds aren't going to have their berries, that those bears aren't going to have their berries, those other plants aren't going to have clean water either. And you have a responsibility to take care of those places too. And so I think that that's something that's really important to look at, in addition to our physical bodies. It's so many other things, and that interconnected. And I talk so much about food systems because it is truly that systems thinking, and all of those webs of connection, even, bringing us together in this webinar today.
Nicole, I think you're muted.
Oh, darn. Sorry. Okay, thank you. I just want to acknowledge the time now and see if anyone else has one last question. It will be a quick one as we're wrapping things up, and I'm going to put in the chat to everyone a survey, and it's optional if you have time to fill that out. We would love it. And also, we are doing a random pick. Clayton wants to send a gift package out, and we are working with that name right now. And so at the end, I'll let Clayton announce that name. Was it just one package that you wanted to send out, Clayton?
Yeah, it'll be just one. It'll have a variety of different traditional foods in it, but just to one person.
Okay. All right. And the last
Hey,
question
Nicole.
I have, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the link for the chat or the link for the survey didn't open for me. It said I needed permission.
Okay.
That'll be fixed in a second.
All right. Okay. Well, Marion will get in there and fix that. Thanks for letting us know, and we'll repost it. And thanks for your patience, everyone, as we figure out the first Zoom of the series. So, and I have one last question while we're working with that survey. Someone's recommending a good first step as someone interested in Indigenous food sovereignty.
A good first step, I would say, is support Indigenous producers. So there's a great resource, indianagfoods.org. I will drop that in the chat, but it is the American Indian Foods Program, indianagfoods.org, before I get distracted. There we go. So this is ran by the American Indian Foods Program, which is part of the Intertribal Agricultural Council, and they have a producer directory. So you can look up producers in your area. You can look up products by type of product. So if you're looking for, Indigenous grown blue cornmeal, if you're looking for hot sauces, if you're looking for wild rice, whatever it may be, you can find those producers and you can buy from them. So I say that that's a great first step. And then there's, of course, a lot of folks that do really good work within this Indigenous food sovereignty space. So if you find yourself looking for organizations to donate to, obviously, NAFSA is great. They're one of the organizers of this event. The Intertribal Buffalo Council. So there's ITBC. They're working on restoring buffalo to tribes. So that's an organization that's doing great work. And there's also more policy things. If you're like, I don't know, I don't know about ordering from native producers, but I really want to do something that can support good policies, check out the Native Farm Bill Coalition. Because they do great work advocating for more Indigenous representation within Indigenous agriculture or on a national level. And so, they'll do fly-ins to DC and they'll tell people what action items are. A lot of that intricate policy reading is done with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, which is housed at the University of Arkansas School of Law. So they do all the tedious, like, let's read the 800-page Farm Bill document and find out all the places we can add the language and tribal into the document, because things like that make a big difference in terms of national policy. So there are a lot of different ways that you can get involved and jump in. I'm really bad at answering questions fast, I think. But hopefully that wasn't too long of an answer. I'm sorry.
No, that was perfect. It wasn't too long. And I just want to let everyone know, sorry for the little jinx on the chat that we weren't able to open it up to everyone, but I think we were able to get most of those questions out. I did I did see someone ask a puffball question and I was kind of curious about that too. So maybe you could put that in the chat as we close up. They were wondering if that was a story specific to one tribe or if it was
Oh yeah,
like
sorry, that's a
general
Blackfeet story. That's one of our
Okay,
Blackfeet
okay.
stories.
All
Yes.
right, that was one of the other questions. So Clayton, I'm going to hand it over to you to let the person know that you're going to be sending this to.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I hope I pronounce it properly. I've been reading the name. It's Doshaya Dodd. I don't know if that's correct pronunciation. I just lost it. Yeah, what did I do with it? Anyway, DOSHIA Dodd. If you could send Nicole or myself an email with a mailing address, and we'll send you a package of a variety of traditional foods from the Traditional Native American Farmers Association. Thank you for being here with us today. And we just like Nicole was saying, this is the first in a series. I'm glad everybody found time to join us today, and hopefully it's going to continue sparking a conversation with your family or your community or in your area. There's a lot more to this discussion, but you know, I hope this gets people thinking, talking, and moving forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Mariah, for giving us that great presentation. I want to let everyone know that this is recorded, and we're going to be working with NAFA, and these recordings are going to be out there at some point. So as you attend these talks, they will be there. And I put the new form up, and it's live now, so you should be able to do that form there. And I wanted to let you know about the next talk that we have coming up. It's going to be next month, June 20th, with Joseph Patanawakwit. And he is an Anishinaabe herbalist that I've been following for some time, and he does a lot of talks all over Canada, in First Nations all over Canada. And I wanted to get the chance to bring his voice out. He has a lot of interesting knowledge that he learned from his grandmother and in his own discoveries on plants. And that's going to be at the same time. It's going to be on a Tuesday, June 20th at the same time. And NAFSA will be putting that information out. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Clayton or Marion?
Just a thank you to Mariah. That was an excellent presentation. We're so happy that we partnered with all of you. And sorry about all the glitches. We're learning here alongside TNAFA. We're really excited about this series, and we're so grateful to Mariah for being so tech savvy and being able to just take it over and run with it. But please pay attention to our social sites, and our website will be having the rest of the series as they come forward. And then if you follow us on Eventbrite, we'll be publishing them as well. So a big thank you to Nicole and Clayton for organizing this, and we're just here and happy to help.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And big thanks to Marion, too, for all of her technical knowledge. So I'm so grateful that we could come together as a team to put this on, and then as a group of people from all different nations, from all different cities, all across this beautiful land to learn about how to bring health and wellness into our lives in all of these different ways. And I'm so appreciative of all the different views that we're going to be bringing on this webinar, because all those views come together to help inform the ways that we can live our best lives. And I'm thankful for Mariah for giving us a glimpse of that part of your life, and look forward to seeing more from Indigikitchen, and encourage everyone to check out her website and check out the videos, and Google her on YouTube. There's some great videos out there, and they've been really great to have on my long car rides, and I learn a lot from them. So thank you everyone very much, and thanks, Mariah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.